Okay, good morning, everyone. Today we going to start our lectures on the historical topics of this Thai study class. My name is Kunakorn Vanichviroon, and we will spend, you know, two lecture, basically around 5 to 6 hours together to go through the whole span of Thai histories. And today will be the first part of this lecture. Basically, I will try to give you an overview of how the history of the societies of the people who settles, and live their life in the territories that would become the country of Thailand, evolve from basically this very simple settlements right after the historical period up towards the time of great kingdoms, empire, and develop into a modern nations. The first parts of the lectures will basically started right after the people in the territory of Thailand passed from prehistoric period into the early historical periods up until the time that Thailand basically has to wither the challenge of colonialism in the mid 19th centuries. So the first part of this history, the lecture we will be covering today, I call it the history of Thailand. And from the slide, which you should be able to see on these video clips, you will notice that I put the subtitles of the topic as from Mueang to Arya Pradesh. From Mueang to Arya Pradesh, what does it mean? To the Thai people, the Thai students, you would automatically recognize that the title, the term Mueang, usually we translate these terms as cities or towns. So that represents our starting points. The time when people throughout the territories that would become Thailand still spend their time, live their life in a very simple urban settings. And our story will continue up until the mid 19th centuries, when the Thai societies or Siam at that time recognize, try to achieve the status of being a civilized nation, which in Thai we use the terms Arya Pradesh. There's a few things that I would like to make clear for you to really benefit and have a very clear assumptions towards what I'm trying to explain to you. I'm historian by training, and generally when you talk about history as a subject, many people tend to expect a lot of boring names, a lot of meaningless dates for you to memorize. I would not really saying that my version of Thai history of Thailand would be something free of names and dates. Of course, when you're dealing with some things about the past, it is unimaginable to tell the whole stories without referring to several specific dates. So we will have to deal with some dates. But I promise to you that I'm not a type of historians whom really obsessed with too many dates. Sometimes it's not only years, but days, months, and years. I will have to really show, the specific dates, the specific years to you, so that you could really have some general understandings of which events took place first and which would probably be the cause of certain phenomena. So be able to pinpoint each important events correctly according to the time that it took place, or we should call it, be able to put each important event into a correct chronological orders would be something that you know everyone would expect when you have to deal with the stories in the past. The second point would be the issue of names. Historians love to really show that they could memorize lots of difficult names. Because you need to be able to memorize some names. Nobody would be able to understand a world histories without recognizing very significant names like Alexander the Great or the Genghis Khans. So you will need to deal with the names, but I will try to keep it as simple as possible so that you would be able to really enjoy, the history of Thailand, and really pay more attention to the factors, the result. Because for me, I would hope to emphasize, to try to convey a more simplistic version of Thai histories to you. A version of Thai history which trying to give you an understanding of why some of the event which you already know and heard about many times actually took place. I do not want my version of Thai history to be, too boring and a lot of things for you to just memorize. You will be able to really memorize things if you could partly understand, its causes and its consequences. So history is more about that. It's more about your ability to understand, your abilities to clarify why certain events took place in the past around, this and that dates. If you could achieve that, I believe that your experience of study histories, not just history of Thailand, but history of any country or any area in the world, would be much more pleasant. Okay, another issue that I would like to raise to you before we start our long journeys chronologically is that what I'm trying to say and what I'm trying to cover in my two lectures is a history that, is history of people and kingdoms and cities which developed and existed within the borders or territories of the modern countries of Thailand. This may sound complicated, but actually it's not. I will try to tell you the stories, the developments took place within the current or the modern borders of Thailand as a country. I have to be very specific about this because most people, many people would have a very important misconception that Thailand existed 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, which is not true, so to speak. If you speak strictly, it's not correct. 500 years ago, you may have some powerful kingdoms like Ayutthaya, which of course exist as a precursor. I do not want to use the word ancestor, but more like a precursor to the developments of the countries of Siam and Thailand. But it doesn't mean that Ayutthaya was Thailand, nor it would mean Sukhothai, Lana would be, a kind of direct ancestor of the modern country of Thailand. It's totally, it's related, but I do not want you to fall into the big traps of projecting the existence of modern nations of the country of Thailand back into the past. 100%. We have to be aware that Thailand, as well as any countries in the world, most of the countries in the world, I would say, were modern inventions. They do not exist for so long. They may have their precursors, their ancient empire or kingdoms, but it doesn't mean that those empire kingdoms like Sukhothai, Ayutthaya was the full, you know, uh, precursors or representations of the modern country of Thailand. So the story I would try to tell you is just, things, developments, kingdoms, people, kings, that used to really rule or directed some societies under the modern territory of Thailand. But it doesn't mean that back then the modern territories or the borders of Thailand existed. You will understand this more clearly when we go through our lectures. So, but keep this in mind, that the stories is about history of people within the borders of modern country of Thailand. And it doesn't mean that Thailand existed, far back into the past. Let's start with the very basic terms, Mueang, which I just explained to you. But let's think more about it in details. When you heard of the term Mueang, it means cities or town. I mean, in a general usage in our Thai language. But if you read historical documents, and actually it's not only restricted to the historical documents, actually in our daily conversations, sometimes we came across a context which we use the term Mueangs to talk about some things which is not really a cities or the town. For example, sometimes we use the term Mueang Jin or Mueang Farang. In this case, we do not trying to talk about specific cities in China or in the West, I mean, in Europe or in Tawantok. But we are talking about Mueang Jin as the country of China, or Mueang Farang basically means the area or the continents of the Caucasians, which is, Europe and North America in most cases. So what I'm trying to say is that the term Mueang could be used to referring to a political unit. It could be small, for example, like a small town, a cities, or it could be very large, like countries or even a continents. So keep this in mind that when you encounter the term Mueang, it is the most basic terms that Thai societies use to call their respective political units. Around 2,500 years ago, I try to put the number in the very simple, numbers. As I mentioned, as I declared to you, I do not want to impose too many unnecessary dates. Around 2,500 years ago, many societies, many settlements throughout the area that would become the country of Thailand. Basically, I'm referring to the area within the map of Thailand, which at that time doesn't exist yet. People within that area slowly emerge from the prehistoric periods, which mean more and more societies, more and more people who live in each different small scale movement slowly embrace writing. And you should heard about it from another lectures already, that when you talk about writing, this is the factors that basically show that people in that societies already crossing the lines from prehistory into historical periods because we use writings as an indicators. So 2,500 years ago, more and more people, each of them live inside small scale mueang throughout the area of Thailand, slowly learn and use written script. This process, doesn't happen all in one go. It's actually required times, and let's say the mueang in the north, I mean the city in the northern part of Thailand and city in the southern part of Thailand doesn't really embrace writing at the same times. But there's a process, which took place around 2,500 years ago up until, perhaps 2,000 years ago. And the characters of those mueang, no matter you talk about the mueang or the cities in the north, northeast, the central part, or in the southern part, each of those mueang look very much the same in the sense that they are small scale settlements and they have a very small population size. And each members of those mueang live in a very simple, kind of like housings, and each of them doesn't really, conduct a different professions. Most of them, of course, were farmers. They are hunter-gatherers. I mean, there's collecting forest products. And each of them hoping to settle within the area that's fertile enough for them to grow rice. So if we could really hop on a time machine and went back in times around 2000 to 2,500 years ago, you probably see a number or a clusters of mueang, each of them, equally small, dotted the riverbank throughout different regions of Thailand. Because being able to find a mueang or a settlement next to the main rivers or the main streams means that you could take benefits from these natural highways, I mean the waterway. Because in Southeast Asia, most territories or most lands, most area of the lands used to be covered by a thick forest or thick vegetations. So once you want to move from mueang A to mueang B, it makes more sense for you to make a journey by the boat along the rivers or the streams, rather than trying to walk into the forest where you need to really cut down huge amount of tree or plants, and you have to risk your life, encounter some creatures like tigers, elephants, and also, of course, you may contracted a disease. So 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, throughout the area of Thailand, you have this mueang, small scale. Each of them look very much the same. There's one issue that so crucial for our understandings of early historical periods of the settlement in Thailand and actually everywhere in Southeast Asia. That issues is about the equations, I mean the importance between lands on one side and populations on the other sides. Land and populations, these are two key factors which should allow us to understand the logic of how the societies develops. Again, I want to share with you the logic, the thought process, rather than to let you memorize everything. It's boring. We understand very well. So let's spend some time clarify these issues. Land and populations. Now you should visualize the image of the map of Thailand. You should be able to visualize that, the map of Thailand. Nowadays, you have something like 70 million people living, residing inside the territories or within the territories of the modern country of Thailand. 70 millions, keep it in mind. But if you go back, if you went back in times, don't have to go very far. Maybe you go back like 200-300 years ago, which is considered such a short time span. We are talking about 2000s. If you go back 300 years ago, the actual populations that live within the same territories, the Thailand, the map of Thailand, would be something like 10 millions at most, I'm afraid. Yeah. You have 70 million people today. And 200 years ago, you probably have 10 millions maximum on the same living, working, make the way to live their life on top of the same amount of land. So what is it? What does it mean? When you have 70 million people trying to make a living on the fixed size of land, many people have to compete with one another to own the land. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that back in the past, the territories was the same. I mean, the size of the area that would become Thailand, we're talking about the same size. But you have a totally different amount of people or the populations who live, inside that amount of lands. And once you have far less, far smaller populations, the scenario was totally different. Nowadays, if you want to buy a piece of land, it's so expensive. That's why even the condo will cost, so much. But back in time, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, 1,000 years, you have very few people and they do not really even compete with one another to try to own too many pieces of land. Because there's so plenty of land available. Actually, the land was really everywhere. It's kind of like waiting for people to pick up their knife or their sword, cut down the tree, and began to plant their crops, turn forest into rice field, and then the land became, meaningful. But if you do not have people to cut down the trees, to cut down the forest, it's remain a forest, and you could not really make so much benefits out of it. What I'm trying to say is that nowadays you have a lot of people on the same piece of land. But back then you have very few people on the same piece of land. So the scenario in the deep past was that people or manpower or populations was more important than the land itself. Because if you have land and you have plenty of land in the past, and you do not have people to really become a laborers, cut down the trees, plant the rice, plant whatever kind of crops they want, the land became meaningless. So keep this in mind that in the past, people or labor was more important than the land. It's not the same as the scenario today. So if you think that, okay, you read about history of Ayutthaya, and then of course everyone's could remember that the Burmese invade Ayutthaya a few times, and you try or you thought that, okay, the Burmese want to own the land so much, then you're wrong. Because in most cases, what the Burmese want, I mean, in case of Burma invasion, they want to take control of some strategic piece of land. Not all, actually, a very strategic piece of land. And they want to take back the populations or the manpowers. So manpowers remains the ultimate resource in the history of Southeast Asia, not just Thai societies, but every countries in South Asia. We are the regions that used to always have a labor shortage. We have a lot of lands. We never have lots of people. Okay. The situations which I explained to you 2,500 years ago, the society emerged from prehistoric periods. Slowly, these trends kind of like pick up. People in different societies could read and write. And then around 1,500 years ago, to give you a very basic numbers again, these basic societies or this basic myth throughout the area of Thailand experienced another wave of major change. This major change, which took place around AD 500 or 1,500 years ago, was the transitions from the local belief in local gods or local spirits, or what the academic would call animistic belief. This animistic belief kind of like being there for 1,000 years. But around 1,500 years ago, the idea that people should believe in the protective powers of the sacred trees, the sacred mountains, the sacred rivers began to change, because there's new kind of religions arise from foreign countries, from overseas. And this new form of religions claims that their teachings or the power of their gods were universals. This is the most important difference between the animistic belief and Hinduism or Buddhism. Animistic belief, let's give you an example, the protective spirits of the Lord of Doi Suthep in Chiang Mai, for example, the Mount Suthep in Chiang Mai. People in Chiang Mai, just imagine, people who live around Chiang Mai area were born, and from the very first day of their life, they noticed that there's a very high mountains kind of like located next to their settlements. And everyone in their societies in the Muang believe that there's spiritual leaders or spiritual powers reside on top of that mountain. Let's call him or her, him, most case, the Lord of Doi Suthep. And the Lord of Doi Suthep could provide spiritual protections to the people around the base of the mountains, which includes the Muang of Chiang Mai. Back then, most people would feel very comfortable to live under this protective power of the Lord of Doi Suthep, because almost all of them would grow up married, perhaps having a families, having their kids, raise their kids, and die around the same area that they were born. What I'm trying to say is that in the past, in the long historical past, people doesn't really move around that much. People doesn't really have a lot of free times for them to go travel. Actually, in the past, if you think or if you want about, sorry, if you say that you need to make a journey from your hometown to some other town, many people would feel insecure and they're not happy. The concept that, okay, let's travel to that village or to this beach doesn't really exist. There's no concept of traveling as we have today. The problems will occur to people who really need to travel, or maybe he's do some business as a merchant, as a trader, and he would like to take some products which he could produce in the area around Chiang Mai to sell in another Muang. Let's say, okay, from Chiang Mai to Pitsanulok. So he will need to make a long journey, and long journey means a lot of, chance for you to get killed, by animals or by thief or, whatever kind of bad thing could happen to you. And because you already make your long journey from Chiang Mai area towards the area of Pitsanulok, so you move yourself or your bodies out of the territories under the protective spirits of the Lord of Doisutapes, which you trust that he will provide you spiritual protections. So when you reach the town or the Muang of Pitsanulok, people in Pitsanulok would have their own versions of local god, animistic gods, maybe the god or goddess of the sacred trees, for example. And since you're coming from Chiang Mai, you believe in your own versions of God of Doisute, but you have to live your life inside territories where majority of people or most people doesn't really know whom's the Lord of Doisute is. So it's become a problem because once the societies or the Muang develop more sophisticatedly, they have much larger populations, and most of that populations learns about, different products, different opportunities that existed in faraway lands. So they would eager to learn more, to trade more with, other Muang. So there's more interactions, more movement of people around the areas. And once you have people moving around a lot, the demands for universal religions became more preeminent. Hindu and Buddhism are totally different religions. Both of them, developed or emerged from the Indian subcontinent. But Hinduism believes in, hundreds or thousands of gods. For example, on this slide, you will notice a carvings of a man with so many hands. Actually, he's dancing. This is the carvings of Lord Shiva, or in Thai, sometimes we call Ishwan. Lord Shiva happened to be one of the three most powerful Hindu gods. It doesn't mean that the Hindu only believe in these three gods, but these three, Brahman, Vishnu or Narayan, and Shiva, happen to be the three of the most famous and the most respected. This god doesn't really confine their powers within specific locations. Brahman, the creator god, Vishnu, the protectors, and Shiva, the destroyers, exert their or claim to exert their powers anywhere, every time. Which means that although there's Indian God, but the power of Lord Shiva should be able to extend or to reach everywhere. So they claim themselves to be a universal gods. And hence, Hinduism is a type of religions we call universal religions. A religions that doesn't have the boundaries for its powers. Buddhism, on the other hand, doesn't believe in any god. Buddhism believes in the teachings or philosophies that has been spoke out and kind of like developed by Lord Buddhas. But even though Buddhism doesn't really believe in God, but it's claimed that the teachings or philosophies of Lord Buddhas is applicable anywhere, universally applies. So Hindu and Buddhism, apart from being religions emerged from India, they are grouped under the title of universal religions. And these two universal religions arrived into Southeast Asia, actually around 2000 years or even earlier. But around 1,500 years ago, leaders of many important movements throughout the area that would become Thailand began to embrace this Hinduism and Buddhism because it's allowed for more flexibilities. And once you have more and more people in different towns and cities sharing the same belief toward Hindu gods or the teaching of Lord Buddhas, it means that these larger numbers of believers could pool their resources together to construct a much more impressive monuments, religious monuments. Again, look at this slide. You will see that the buildings was constructed out of pink color sandstone. This is Prasat Hin Phnom Rung Sanctuary in northeastern Thailand. The possibility of building these stone structures could only become feasible when large number of people share the same belief and put their resources together. In the society that only believe in their local gods, what we call animisms, the amount of resource would not be enough for them to build something this big, this impressive, and this long-lasting. For Buddhism as well, we began to see larger monuments being constructed around these times, 1,500 years ago. Apart from the arrival of universal religions as the key factor number one, the second key factors that play a crucial role in transforming, small mueang throughout the area, throughout Thailand, into a fewer larger mueang, which we could call empire or early kingdoms. Number one, arrival of universal religions, because more and more people sharing the same belief, so they kind of live together under the same ideologies. Second, more resource has been kind of like transferred, throughout the world through the transcontinental trade routes, which you can see on this map. On this map, you will notice that there's kind of red color lines and blue color lines. Those red lines are what we usually call the Silk Roads or the Silk Routes. And you would notice that although the main part of Silk Roads connect China in the east with the Mediterranean Sea or Europe, which I prefer to call Mediterranean world in the west. This is the main line of Silk Road that I think everyone should have heard about it. But actually Silk Road split into many lines. On this map, you see there's few lines that kind of like run from Central Asia to Pakistan. There's line that run from the city of Xi'an or Chang'an in China into the Gulf of Bengal and South China Sea. Apart from those red lines, there are also blue color lines. And these blue color lines are what we call maritime silk routes, or the silk road that went by the sea. And I would argue that although most people only heard about Silk Road, the land, trade routes, but actually the maritime Silk routes or the Silk Road that went by the sea play even more important roles in connecting people from different civilizations together. And cities, kingdoms that located along these red and blue lines would happen to be the cities that benefit the most from the trade, the monies and the tax that flow, from east to west, from west to east. So with the arrival of universal religions providing common ideologies and the formations of international trade routes, both land and sea, that provided new resources, we began to see the first generations of kingdoms or empire show up in different parts of the area that would become Thailand. So around 1,500 years ago to 1,000 years ago, in the southern part of Thailand, we will see, the formation of a cluster of Muang or the cluster of cities, which call themselves Srivijaya kingdoms or Srivijaya in Thai. The Srivijaya kingdom was a kind of like a mysterious empire or kingdom of South Asia. Because although we know very well that the area under the control of Srivijayas basically span southern part of Thailand, peninsula side of Malaysia, Singapore of course, Sumatra Island and Western Java. We really have no doubt that, okay, this is area of Srivijaya. But we still not quite understand what kind of kingdom Srivijayas used to be. Many people doesn't really agree that Srivijayas has only one capital cities. Many people still debate whether the town of Chaya in southern part of Thailand or the city of Palembang in the southeastern part of Sumatra Island in Indonesia, which were the royal capital cities of Srivijaya King. Some people actually have a totally different ideas that Srivijaya was not really a unified kingdom, but it existed as a confederation, basically a kind of like unions of small trading kingdoms that comes together and work together to control this Strait of Malaccas and the Trans-Peninsula Point. Here, the Strait of Malacca is one of the most important trade routes in today's world as well as in the ancient times. So just imagine if the leaders, and I emphasize this plural, the leaders of town that form the Srivijaya kingdoms or confederations could really control trans-peninsula trade here, could control Strait of Malacca and the Straits of Sundas here. So basically, anyone who would like to make a journey from South China Sea to Indian Ocean or from Indian Ocean to the South China Sea would need to cross territories under Srivijaya control. And once you control these really critical bottlenecks in the global trade routes or the global trade system, you could impose a very high tax because everyone would have to pay. This is so critical that there's has no other options to go. And because of these mechanisms, the control of the main trades bottleneck, it's allowed the leaders or the elites of the Srivijaya kingdoms or empire to have plenty of resources to begin building, stupa, pagodas, and support the creations of some exquisite art piece like these examples of the Mahayana Buddhism's art objects. Around the same times, in the central part of Thailand, in the south you have Srivijaya. In the central part of Thailand, the area around, lower central part of Thailand, like Bangkok, Ayutthaya, Nakhon Pathom, Suphanburi, Nakhon Nayok, you have another kingdoms which we call or we known as Tawaravadi. Tawaravadi flourished in central part of Thailand. Most of the leaders of Tawaravadi, the Muang that exists as or under Tawaravadi kingdoms, believe in Hinayana Buddhisms, basically the Theravada Buddhisms, the version of Buddhisms that the majority of populations of the modern country of Thailand believe. And this Hinayana or Theravada Buddhisms believe in simple life. As you can see, Buddha image produced by Tawaravadi artisans has been designed to represent this form of Buddhism, Hinayana Buddhism or Theravada Buddhisms. Therefore, you will notice that the robes of this Buddha image will look very simple, in contrast to the Buddha image that has been produced under Srivijaya kingdom, which believe in another form of Buddhism we call Mahayana Buddhism, which doesn't mind, the luxuries of decors and other things. Tawaravadi flourished in central part of Thailand, and the largest Tawaravadi cities that still could be seen today is the city of Nakhon Pathom. On this image, you will see the shape of Nakhon Pathom cities. You would notice that it looks like oval shapes. Some people call it, a kind of rectangular shape with the curved corners, doesn't have a sharp corners. And while Srivijaya flourished because of its control of Strait of Malacca, Tawaravadi kingdom flourished because it have almost a direct access to maritime trades. Many people would probably question these claims because when you talk about Nakhon Pathom and Utong in Suphanburi, usually you doesn't associate Nakhon Pathom or Utong as a seaport because it's located deep inland and far away from the sea. But from geological studies, we understand that if you go back in time around 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, the coast of the central part of Thailand would look totally different. If you compare to the modern coastline, here the modern coastlines of central part of Thailand, and here you have Krungthep Mahanakhon of Bangkok and Pathum Thani, even Ayutthaya, practically under the waters. Bangkok, Pathum Thani, and Ayutthaya, not that long ago, used to be kind of like wetland, a mud sea, or the shallow seas. We know this from very clear evidence of the skeletons of the whale. I think everyone understands that the whale happen to be a very large sea or marine creatures. And if you could discover skeleton of a whale in Rangsit and in Nakhon Pathom, basically where the area near the current main campus of Kasetsat universities, then you should not have any doubt that not that long ago, just a few thousand years ago, Bangkok was under the sea. And around that times, up until perhaps 2000 years ago, the cities like Suphanburi here, Nakhon Pathom, even Ratchaburi used to locate it much closer to the sea, and the ship that carry various kind of goods could sail to almost reach the main port of this town, Suphanburi, Nakhon Pathom, Ratchaburi. So what I'm trying to say is that Thawarawadi kingdoms, although located in central part of Thailand, also benefit hugely from engaging with others, kingdoms or empire, and benefit from the sea trade. Around the same time, Sriwijaya in the south, Thawarawadi in the central parts, in the area of northeastern part of Thailand, there are also a major developments that transform, small size Mueang. Some of them turn into a major population centers, a major cities, and began to witness the constructions of large-scale stone monumental structures. We are talking about the cities of Phimai in Nakhon Ratchasima in northeastern area, and the city of Lopburi, which previously they call it Lavo. These two Mueang represents cities that grew and became very important because of its associations with the rise of the Khmer Empire in the area of the modern country of Cambodia. I'm sure everyone heard about Angkor Wat, world largest religious structures located in the modern country of Cambodia. But 1,500 years ago, there's no borders between Cambodia and Thailand. Actually, Thailand as a country, Cambodia as a modern nation doesn't exist. So people from the royal capital cities of the Khmer exert their influence to, many parts of mainland Southeast Asia, including southern part of Vietnam, southern part of Laos, northeastern part, and portion of central part of Thailand, for example. So the new idea, new ideologies, and the riches of the Khmer Empire inspired and affected the developments of many Mueang that now located within the country of Thailand. Phimai, for example, as you can see from this slide, became the site of the constructions of the largest stone sanctuaries in territory of Thailand. And the Khmer king believe in both Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism. Most of the time, they believe in Hinduism. Only towards the later part of their existence that the Khmer king shifted from Hinduism to Mahayana Buddhism. As you can see from these stone sculptures of the Avalokitesvara, basically the image that reflected the Mahayana Buddhistic belief. So 1,500 years ago, you have Sriwijaya kingdom in the south, Thawarawadi in the centers, and the cities flourish under the Khmer Empire in northeastern Thailand and part of central part of Thailand. These three first generation of kingdoms flourish for several hundred years. And then around 700 to 800 years ago, all of them declines and collapse. I will not go into details, why Tawarawadi, Sriwijaya, or the Khmer Empire fail, weakens, decline, and collapse, because it will be beyond the scope of our lectures. But what actually important to us was that once these three first generations of kingdoms declines, it's kind of like open up the stage for the developments of what you may call second generations of bigger or more powerful movement, or second generations of kingdoms in the area that would become the modern country of Thailand. These second generations kingdoms, there's actually several of them, but four that probably claim to be the most important includes Lan Na Kingdom in the northern part of Thailand, which center in Chiang Mai and Lamphun. Then, if you move to the south, we will have Mueang Nea, okay, the area of Sukhothai, Sisachanalai, and Pitsanulok. And further south, around the Gulf of Thailand, you will have the group that I call it Delta area, the cluster of towns located on the Chao Phraya River deltas. And this includes towns like Suphanburi, Phetchaburi, Lopburi, and Ayutthaya. And fourth, you have Lan Chang, which span Mekong rivers. And the center of Lan Chang kingdom shifted from Luang Prabang to Vientiane. But the influence of the Laotian kingdoms doesn't really, stop with Mekong rivers. Nowadays, people would see Mekong River as a borderlines between Thailand and Laos, a modern country of Thailand and Laos. But in the past, Mekong rivers never play a role as a borders, rarely play a role as a borders, I would say. It's more like a unified factors that allow people on both sides of Mekong rivers to interact and develop. To put a long story short, by 13th centuries, 700 or 800 years ago, the territory that would become country of Thailand was dominated by second generations of major towns or cities, Lan Na, Lan Chang, Mueang Nea, and the Delta groups. And the leaders of these four second generation state or second generation kingdoms, no matter what kind of language they use for communications, they call themselves the Thai, in terms of ethnicities. So it doesn't matter that you are Lan Na king, you are Laotian king, ruling Lan Chang kingdoms, you are Sukhothai king, Pitsanulok kings, or Suphanburi king. But they all see themselves as the Thai. 13th century has been called by historians the Thai century, the Thai centuries. And I emphasize this spelling, Thai, to differentiate it from Thai, Thai, which related to the modern country of Thailand. I use the word Thai in a much broader sense. And in 13th and 14th centuries, this second generation kingdom, the Thai, the kingdom that ruled by the people who see themselves as the Thai, developed many advancements that would become a hallmark of Thai culture or Thai civilizations. I'm saying that, nowadays, in the period which we live inside the country of Thailand, if people began to think about, okay, what are some iconic or recognizable contribution or achievements, the uniqueness of Thai cultures. Then there are few things that we could talk about, and most of that kind of like show up around 13th centuries. The most recognizable of them all would be Thai alphabets, of course. Many people in the world, I mean, many tribe, many group of people around the world have their own spoken language. There are like thousands of spoken language um, around the world. But actually, there's not that many written script. Many spoken language borrow written scripts from other culture. But for Thai language, we are one of not a large number of societies that could claim that we have our own set of alphabets to be used together with our spoken language. And the developments of the Thai alphabets took place around this, 13th, 14th centuries as well. Another achievement would be irrigation systems, the water management know-how. Many people probably doesn't notice that the reason why UNESCO recognized Sukhothai cities as a World Heritage was not really so much about its beautiful Buddha image or the grand pagoda, but it's more about the very clever irrigation system that the Sukhothai people developed back then. Sukhothai located in the dry zone. It doesn't rain a lot, but during the flooding season, then you have a lot of waters, huge amount of waters kind of like flowing down south from the Lana area and flood Sukhothai for a month or two. But apart from that, Sukhothai often experience drought and lack of waters. So Sukhothai king need to handle these problems, and they built reservoirs. They built, lot of small scale lakes like the one you can see on this slide we call Trapang, to store excess waters to be used during the dry seasons. In terms of architecture, Sukhothai people also developed some unique features. For example, you can see on this slide here, the tallest pagodas come in the shapes of the lotus bud or lotus flower. We call it the Jedi Pumkabin or the lotus bud Jedi Dobotu pagodas. So be able to develop your own style of sculpture, architectures, also reflected a certain degrees of confidence and autonomy of that society. And the last one, Sukhothai has been known as the producers of porcelains that we call Sangkalo in grand scale for exporting purpose. Apart from material cultures, many societies, many Thai kingdom, I mean the kingdom that ruled by the people who call themselves the Thai, also developed another set of social relationship, which we call patron and client's relationship. Patron and client relationships may sound a bit complicated, but it's actually would be simplified as an unequal relationship between the two parties or the two sides. On one side, you have the patrons or the overlords, basically people who happen to be more powerful, probably richer, older, for example. And on the other side, you have the clients or the subordinates, the weakest or the poorer one. this relationship between unequal parties happen to be the have natures of social interactions in Thai societies, at least, since 700 years ago, at least. When we talk about this, many people would probably feel like, okay, you're talking about inequalities in the societies. Yes, we are talking about inequalities because um, status, I mean, the unequal status or the hierarchy of people existed in almost every ancient kingdoms or civilizations throughout the world. And to handle these unequal relations, it's actually for the benefit of both parties. People back then doesn't really care much, that they need to be treated equal with one another. Because between these unequal parties, they're expecting and fulfilling, the requirements and expectations of people on the other side. To illustrate or to make it more easier for you to understand, patron and client relationships, are unequal relationships between, for example, the richer people, I mean the landlords and the farmers. Let's say, just use this as an example. The landlord happened to have lots of land, and often, I mean the case, much richer. On the other hand, you have the farmers, doesn't have much land, but have a lot of labors to contribute. If these two people work together, both side benefits. The farmer got the land for them to work on. The landlord could utilize their land by employing the labors from the farmers. Unequal relationship like this existed in almost every level of relationships of the Thai societies. And it came with a burden. For example, the landlord or the merchants who happen to be so rich already doesn't really care much if he's gonna get a little bit richer. But he would probably be more happy if other people came, show them respect, give them recognitions. Basically, I'm saying that people who occupy higher positions, like the rich traders or merchants, expect the subordinate to show some respect. The subordinate, like the farmer or the labor, were ready or more than willing to show respect as long as they receive, physical rewards or monies from the overlords. So unequal relationship doesn't mean a problem. Actually, it's unequal, but unequal because it's allow people to really fit in. This unequal relationship, sometimes could be represents in the form of mandala. On the left hand side, you have big green circle in the middle, four smaller green circle around the corners, and then you have this green band and red and yellow color band surrounded the center area. And this mandala came from Tibet, Tibetan mandalas. It actually represents the idea of how people look at the universe. People have this kind of common imaginations that at the center of the universe, you have this highest peak, the green, the big green circle here, surrounded by four smaller peaks. And this concept of mandala existed as a prototype for the design and the constructions of most main religious structures, temple, or even the palace throughout Asia, not only in Thailand. um, but here we show you the case of Thailand, one of the most easy to recognize. Here you have the image of Wat Arun, one of the landmarks of Bangkok. And at the center, you see this tallest paprang or towers. This actually has been designed to represent the centers of this mandala. It represents Mount Meru, the mountain peaks that believed to be the core of the universe. And here at the four corners, you have smaller towers, which you could immediately recognize as these four green towers. So what I'm trying to say is that unequal relationship was the fact of life of people around that times, even up until today, I would say. But the inequalities doesn't mean that it would be the problems all the times. As long as people from different class could really find a balance to have a win-win situations, this system would prove to be a functional one. Around these times, the Chinese still remains as the most powerful countries in this part of the world. The Chinese emperors see himself as the rulers of the universe, and he called his kingdom the Middle Kingdom or Zhonghua. Basically, China see itself as the center of the civilized world, and the Chinese emperors expected the leaders or the kings of other kingdoms to come and show him respect, show him recognitions. The Chinese was very details of how they use the term to call foreign leaders. They would call foreign leaders kings and never call foreign leaders as emperor, because from their point of views, there could only be one leaders, the Chinese emperors. I mean, the only one ultimate leaders. So if you see things in a much larger scale, you will see that unequal relationship doesn't only existed between the older people, the younger people, the richer one and the poorer ones, the kings of the kingdoms or the people of the kingdoms. But actually, this unequal relationship existed in the international relations or relationship between larger kingdom like China and smaller kingdoms like Lana, like Sukhothai. But this case of unequal relationship between Chinese kingdoms and other smaller kingdoms also show that even though the Chinese emperor claimed that only him could be called emperors, but the king of Lana, the king of Sukhothai, the king of Korea, the king of the Okinawan kingdoms, still more than willing to travel to China, to send ambassadors to China, to show inferior positions and to have guarantee the Chinese superior positions. Why smaller kingdoms became so happy of recognizing Chinese power? Simply because it benefits smaller kingdoms by establishing formal relations. The Chinese emperor recognized the ruler of the small kingdoms. And the most important factor of them all, by having the recognition from the Chinese emperors, it means that the trading relationship between China and smaller kingdoms could be very profitable to the merchants of the smaller kingdoms. Around 14th to 15th centuries, one of these four second generation of Muang show up and happen to become more powerful than the rest. And this cities was called Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya belonged to the Delta groups, the group of towns that include Suphanburi, Lopburi. It's located closest to the sea on the delta of Chao Phraya Thajin river systems. And because of its locations, perhaps, because of its proximities to the sea, Ayutthayan king could engage much more frequent and much more effectively with traders whom arise from faraway lands. Even though the trader would like to would like to sail all the way to Sukhothai and probably make a long journey to Lanna in the north. If they came by the sea, and most of them came by the sea, they will need to pass through territory under Ayutthaya control first. And of course, if you're the king of Ayutthaya, you know your great advantage very well. You would use these opportunities to, collect tax. Okay, that's number one. Number two, you would need your opportunity to search and survey goods on board. And if you find, new form of weapons, maybe new type of guns, you would definitely have to secure those weapons before it would get into the hands of Sukhothai king or Chiang Mai king, because the Sukhothai king or Chiang Mai king could use that weapons against you. What I'm trying to say is that because Ayutthaya located closest to the sea, it benefit from sea trades. It could collect tax and it could really have a better access to modern weapons. So Ayutthaya became rich, powerful, its army equipped with better weapons. So this allowed Ayutthaya army to expand, to the point that it's captured and incorporated Sukhothai into their own kingdoms. And from time to time, threatened Chiang Mai, the centers of Lanna. Ayutthaya king became rich because of trades and military advantage with the access to better weapons. But it doesn't mean that Ayutthaya king would be too happy to fight in the war all the times. Actually, Ayutthayan king understand very well the point that I present to you in the beginning of the lecture, that in historical times, people or manpower was the most important resources. So if you fight in the war, of course, you should expect that many of your soldiers would be killed or, kind of like arrested. So you're losing manpowers. Losing manpower is not good at all because, production of rice and almost everything in the age before the industrial revolutions require manpower. If you lose manpowers, basically your kingdom become weakened. So Ayutthayan king, after conquest of Sukhothai and threatened Chiang Mai or Lanna, Ayutthayan king trying to employ diplomatic measures basically trying to negotiate, trying to become friends, and the most obvious policies was to send the daughters or the son of the king, basically the prince or the princess, to marry with the royal families of other kingdoms. So because of its locations, because of its better weapons, and because of this, marriage diplomacies, it allowed Ayutthaya to become the preeminent powers in the area that would become Thailand's in 14th and 15th centuries. Ayutthaya became prosperous because the ship from faraway land could sail up Chao Phraya rivers directly towards the main city of Ayutthaya, which surrounded by rivers. Another factor is that Ayutthaya itself controlled the peninsula part of Thailand, the area of Phetchaburi, Prajopkiriขัน. The peninsula part of Thailand act as an important bridge for merchant or foreign traders who came from Indian Oceans and want to travel to South China Sea, or came from South China Sea and want to travel to Indian Oceans, especially when there's a news of the pirates, attacking many ships in the Strait of Malaccas. And once you have that kind of crisis, many merchants would, rather take, other optional routes than risk to encounter a pirate in the Strait of Malaccas. So one of their options was to move their goods, to the peninsula, upper peninsulas, and then move the goods across the narrow parts of the peninsula. So Ayutthaya at that time, we are talking about 15th, 16th centuries. Ayutthaya controlled ports on the Gulf of Thailand side or the eastern side of the peninsulas, as well as the cities like Thawai Marit Tanao Si on the western side of the peninsulas. So this has become the most beneficial, part of territories. And this allow Ayutthaya to become the center of exotic goods and forest products. Okay, there's one misspelling here. It became known as Asian entrepot. Entrepot means a kind of like marketplace, okay, to use the modern terms. The place where people from faraway lands often move their goods and come and expect to be able to trade their goods with other goods. So it's like, a big marketplace. In Ayutthaya, you can find items that originated from China, India, far away as Arabia, and in Malay world. So basically, if you are merchant from Arabia, you want to purchase like Chinese goods, maybe Chinese silk or Chinese porcelains. You do not need to sail your ships all the way from Arabia to China. You only need to sail around like halfway to Ayutthaya, and then you could expect to find many Chinese products being sold in Ayutthaya markets. So 16th century, Ayutthaya became very rich. And once you became too rich, it attracted attentions from your neighbors. As I mentioned just now, Ayutthaya city is the main city is located here in central part of Thailand. But around this 16th centuries, Ayutthaya still control, these peninsulas. And not only in the eastern part, but also the western part. So many merchants prefer to use this like a very narrow part of the land, the peninsulas, as an options for them to avoid the Strait of Malacca, which although the most convenient routes, but it's probably one of the most risky routes also because of pirate activities. Ayutthaya became rich so late, the second half of the 16th centuries. Ayutthaya encounters war and challenge from both the Burmese from the western side, and from time to time you have some smaller challenge from the Cambodian kings as well. But as we know, it was the Burmese from the city of Peku, or in Thai we call Hong Sawadi, that could successfully capture Ayutthaya in 1559. And the story after the first fall of Ayutthaya in 1559 has became, has been really been talked about all the times. The story of the revival of Ayutthayan powers under the control of this, under the victories of this warrior king, King Naresuan, whom reclaims Ayutthaya preeminent powers in the Chao Phraya basins. King Naresuan pushed back the Burmese. He actually invaded the Burmese, also. And after the King Naresuan passed away, war between Ayutthaya and the Burmese states continued for few decades. But by early 17th centuries, the war between Siamese Kingdom of Ayutthaya and the Burmese Kingdom of Peku reached the state that we call stalemate. Stalemate means that both sides cannot really won over the others. Basically, it's like the situations which probably could compare with the conflict in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia now, that both parties kind of like hold their grounds, but none of them could really push the other side back. And this kind of war became, I would say, very expensive. It's draining huge resources from the states. And this resource, again, to emphasize the manpower, because once you kind of like keep on fighting without winning anything, it means that you are losing powers, using your manpowers. Your soldiers die, many of them, injured, but you could not capture new people because you can't win the war. So by early 17th centuries, Ayutthaya upgraded the city wall. It's converted it wooden and earthen city wall into a brick wall that could place cannon on top. And once Ayutthaya has been effectively defended by this new brick wall and cannons, it became very difficult for anyone to break through. So once you fight the war for so long, and then you could not really win, no one could really win. So it became kind of like a drain of resource. It became too expensive. Hence, both Siamese Kingdom of Ayutthaya, the Burmese states, and the late arrival Vietnamese that began to show up in the northern part of Vietnam today, have reached the status of balance of powers. It means that these three major kingdoms of mainland Southeast Asia, Burma, Siam, or the modern country of Thailand, and Vietnam, kind of like recognize each other's, that they are more or less an equal powers. None of them could easily win over the others. The Burmese became a preeminent state in the Irrawaddy river valleys. For Ayutthaya, it became the most important centers in the Chao Phraya and Mekong river systems. Ayutthayan king claims to rule over the Khmer people, the Laotians, the Lanna people in the north, and the Shan people as well. 17th centuries, became a time of prosper for Ayutthaya because there's no major war being fought. Because main powers, main kingdoms in the regions recognize that the war has become too expensive and there's no point fighting. And once you have a long peace, economic activities kind of like pick up and has been revived. Ayutthaya became known as a trade hub of Southeast Asia. The cities probably have up over 200,000 people living in the main city areas. Some projections even claim that Ayutthaya around this time, 17th centuries, was one of the largest cities in the world, with populations close to 1 million, which personally, I believe this claim is a little bit, too far. Ayutthaya was one of the larger cities in Asia. For this, it's probably true because the Chinese even call Ayutthaya the great cities, and Chinese cities are often very big already. So if the Chinese call anyone big city, it means that it must really be very big. 17th centuries, a peaceful time. You have a lot of merchants, tradesmen, and ambassadors travel to Ayutthaya, and the ambassadors that travel to Ayutthaya often wrote down, detail about what kind of city was like, what kind of people walking around, which temple and where the palace located here, and so on and so forth. So we are in a way lucky because foreigners who arrived to Ayutthaya in 17th century write down many things that has become the most important informations about Ayutthaya itself. We know about the size. We know about you know ethnic groups that living inside the city of Ayutthaya. We know about products that Ayutthaya export to foreign countries. On this image, the image on the left happened to be a map of Ayutthaya that the French ambassadors uh, drew during his stay in Ayutthaya. You have to understand that ambassadors have to work almost like a spy, basically collecting informations so that he understands the strengths of each kingdom and the benefit that he or his countries could make out of it. From this map, you will see that Ayutthaya has been surrounded by the rivers. Chao Phraya River here and here down south flow to Bangkok and the sea. And inside or within the main cities, you will see there's network of roads and the palace located to the northwest. But one of the most important features in this Ayutthaya map was the locations of foreign village or foreign communities. Um, most of them, all of them, located in the southern parts of Ayutthaya. Here you have the Japanese village, the Dutch village here. You have the Malay village, the Chinese village, for example. So you could imagine that Ayutthaya existed almost like, the main cities ruled by the Siamese and the Chinese. But then you have a small, not a small part of town, um, has been designated as a foreign community. On the right hand side, you have the drawing of Ayutthaya trading ships. And this ship was written by the Okinawan's port master. The port master at Okinawa town, would questions, have like interview, people who place their ship in the port. They will interview to gather information about what happens in your hometown, for example. But for us, this allow us to see what kind of ship or what kind of vessels a European king sent to trade with foreign countries. In this case, with Okinawan and Japan. We know that Ayutthaya happened to be one of the largest, probably the largest cities and most cosmopolitan in Southeast Asia during the 17th centuries. Foreigners wrote down that if you walk along the street of Ayutthaya, you would notice people of so many different ethnic groups um, shopping on the street practically, and they're spoken so many different language. There's a Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Cham from the southern Vietnam, the Mon from southern Burma, and you have the Portuguese, you have the Arab, Indian, Persian, Japanese, Malay, the French, the Dutch, and the English. Inside Ayutthaya of 17th centuries, society has become so cosmopolitan that the king, the most important king during this time was King Narai. We often call King Narai the Great. And King Narai was a very open-minded monarch. Nowadays, people would use the term like, the king with a global view, because he was very keen in learning about, the international relations, what happened in Europe, and he happened to be very active in initiates forming diplomatic relations with some of the most important kingdom at that time. Many of you would know and could notice right away that here you have the image of King Narai, and here you have ambassadors from the court of King Louis XIV of France, handling or passing the letter from King Louis XIV to King Narai. And on the other side here, you have the group of Thai nobilities kind of like bowing to the ground, because according to the Thai traditions or the Thai law, no one should look at the king directly. And here you have the guy named Constantine Phokas, who happened to be the Greek adventurers who happens to make his way to Ayutthaya and has been well trusted by King Narai. The court of King Narai was, I would say, an epitome or the exemplars of how cosmopolitan Ayutthaya society was. King Narai often employed foreigners, to work for him. Some work as mercenaries or the bodyguard, like the Japanese and the Portuguese bodyguard. Some work as engineer, some work as doctor, and some even has been trusted to become the governor of some town. King Narai exchanged ambassadors, not only with the French, but also with the Netherlands, and one of the most important one was probably the exchange of ambassadors with the Persian court. Persians, I mean today's Iran. One attractive features of Ayutthaya kingdom in this time was the spirit of openness. Ayutthayan king happened to be very open to allow people who believe in different religions like Islam's or Christianities to settle in Ayutthaya. There's never a restrictions in terms of forcing people to adopt one set of belief uh, show up in the record of Ayutthayan histories. But the reign of King Narai, ended with the crisis of 1688 when the king fell ill and the Thai nobilities, for a while felt neglected. The Thai nobility believed that that they feel that the king favor foreigners over them. So once King Narai fell ill and about to pass away, a group of Thai nobilities seized the powers, basically kill falcons and banish um, many foreign um, foreigners away from the court of Ayutthaya. So, with the end of the reign of King Narai, the influence of the foreigners, especially European foreigners, declined hugely. But it doesn't mean that the late Ayutthaya society or the Ayutthayan kingdom during the last dynasty, the dynasty called Branpur, would became, inward looking and stop trading with other kingdom. Not at all. Actually, the late Ayutthaya society was a time of economic growth and the market economic expansions. Actually, the overall trading activities doesn't decline. The trade only declined with Europe, but it has been um, kind of like replaced by the expansion, the huge expansion with the trade with the Qing dynasty China and the Malay world. But the main problems was not really how to make good money. Ayutthaya seems to be very successful with that. But the problem was once the societies experience more than a century long of peaceful time, the social structures that act as a backbone of Thai societies became weakened. If you look at the Sakdina system, the unequal relationship of patron and clients that I explained to you, that you have the master or the knight and the pride or the commoners that usually play a role as subordinate, helping each others, fulfilling each others. And the nobility became rich, especially from the manpower he got when he successfully win the war. But once you have a long peaceful period, there's no war for the nobilities to claim a victories. So nobility became, less influential. And the people who became the most influential people in the kingdoms, apart from the king, happened to be the trade ministry of Paklang. Because peaceful time, trading activities, flourish and lots of money could be made out of it. So when the society that used to rely on the control of manpowers now shifted to be arranged for the trade, for the benefit from trades, the strength of the knight and pride relationship was in a serious decline. So this sets the stage for the fall of Ayutthaya. In the year 1766, the Burmese from the new capital city of Angwa invaded Ayutthaya with the same reasons. Ayutthaya was a rival port cities to the Burmese one. So the Burmese want to get rid of Ayutthaya, and the Burmese want to control the peninsulas, the most beneficial parts of the lands, and ultimately the Burmese want a control of manpowers. Again, I don't want to repeat this, but I have to say um, more and more often to really remind you that in historical time of Southeast Asia or Thailand, control of manpower was the most important thing that you can think of. So the Burmese came and they decided to surround the cities for almost 2 years, blocking Ayutthaya from receiving new supplies. And after trying to fight back the Burmese for almost 2 years, Ayutthaya fell to the Burmese troops in 1767, and that ended a long period of Ayutthaya as the main political centers in the area that would become Thailand. The fall of Ayutthaya was a catastrophe of the people in the Thai world, I mean in the Thai cultural world, because Ayutthaya happened to be the most sophisticated, the most prosperous, and the most enduring political, economical centers, a cultural center as well, of the Thai world. After Ayutthaya fell, General Taksin, who would reign as King Taksin, quickly repopulated the Delta area and found a new capital cities in a small town that at that time known as Bangkok. Bangkok existed as a port town in the southern part of Ayutthaya for more than 100 years. And I mean, when you talk about Bangkok, majority of population of Bangkok before the fall of Ayutthaya or before the arrival of King Taksin were Chinese and Vietnamese, because there's a people who engage deepest in trades. King Taksin decided to pick Bangkok as his new base because Bangkok is small enough for the group of people he got, and the city of Bangkok already have city wall to defend itself. So King Taksin could use, the existed city wall to defend the cities. King Taksin decided to build his new, small or probably temporary palace in the western side of the Bangkok cities, the area they call Thonburi. So the time of King Taksin has been called Thonburi period. But I want to correct this misunderstanding that King Taksin built new cities in Thonburi. This is not quite true, because actually the town that he picked to become the site of his new capital city was Bangkok. But he only decided to build his palace on the western side or on the Thonburi side, and decided to use the term Thonburi. So in a way, I'm saying that there's no such thing as a new city of Thonburi. Actually, it's just the western expansions of the city of Bangkok, which already existed for a long time. King Taksin happened to be a general with Chinese background. So he employed his Chinese connections, trying to revise the economy very well, very fast, and he seems to be very successful. Within 15 years, the perimeters or the scale of the King Taksin's territories expand to the northeastern, and a good part of southern Thailand. But then his reign ended mysteriously, I would say, with the military coup by the Prayajakri on the ground that King Taksin has become abnormal. With the military coup of Prayajakri, Prayajakri proclaims himself as a ruler of a new dynasty, a dynasty called Jakri, and he himself ruled with the title King Rama I. And with this new title, King Rama I and the new dynasty, Jakri dynasties, we entering the new period. Sometimes we call Bangkok periods. Sometimes we call Ratanakosin period. This is a kind of like formal names of Bangkok. Or you can even call the time of the Jakri kings. The first three kings of Jakri dynasty, namely King Rama I, Rama II, Rama III, basically, was the times of rebuilding, expanding the city of Bangkok. When the reign of King Taksin ended, King Rama I decided to relocate the side of the royal palace from the western side, from Thonburi side, back into the Bangkok side or the eastern side of Chao Phraya rivers. And the city has been kind of rebuilt and expanded. And the model that King Rama I used to design the city of Bangkok was based on the city of Ayutthaya. This is not surprising at all. As I say, Ayutthaya happened to be the most glorious cities, the most enduring cities. So, of course, if you want to build new cities, there's no other example existed as well. I mean, as good. The Ayutthaya was basically the best example. That's why if you move around the older part of cities of Bangkok, the Ratanakosin Island, as they call, you would encounter many locations that use the same names as what existed in Ayutthaya periods, like Wat Mahathat, Wat Ratchaburana, for example, and also the shapes of the city of Bangkok, has been decided to be quite identical to Ayutthaya. King Rama I, Rama II, Rama III also expand the territories from of the control of Bangkok kings, to many faraway corners. They waged war to expand the Siamese control to the peninsula area, to the state of Kedah and Terengganu in modern country of Malaysia. They captured Chiang Mai and waged several wars with the Laotian kingdom to capture Vientiane, and also attacking Long Wat, the cities of the Cambodians. And as a rule of war, when you wage war, you want or you expected to get back some prisoner of war as a manpower. So the captures Malay, Laos, and Cambodians has been resettled in the area around Bangkok. Some of them has been settled in Lat Krabang area, for example, Saraburi area, for example, to become the source of manpower. Again, we are back to the same topics. Manpower was the key. And another reasons from trying to secure manpower was incentive for King Rama the first, second, and third, the first three king of Bangkok Empire, to wage war was to try to divert the flow of resources from faraway corners to be shipped to foreign land from the port of Bangkok. The most important, the most obvious example happens to be King Rama the First and King Rama the Third attempt to capture and destroy the city of Vientiane. On this map, you will see one of the first geographically correct map in Thai culture. We have many maps well before the reign of King Rama III, but those maps, has been drawn to fit in Buddhistic cosmologies, and it doesn't really reflect that realities. But here you have the map that available in the reign of King Rama III, basically early 19th centuries, and you can tell even from the first glimpse that here, the big black color band represent Mekong rivers, and here you have Mae Nam Moon, Mae Nam Chi, and this is the area of northeastern part of Thailand. You have here Ping Wang Yom Nan, tributary of Chao Phraya river systems, and here the Pasak rivers. The three rivers converge around Ayutthaya Islands. So this map has been kind of like made to represent actual location of rivers and village, and the intention was to allow the armies to have a guiding map for them to plan ahead, where they should stop and take a rest, where there's a possibilities of enemies, setting up some defense. The reign of King Rama the First, the Second, and especially the reign of King Rama the Third was the great time of trades. As I say, even before the fall of Ayutthaya, the trade with the Eastern countries, Asian countries, expand a lot. And although when you talk about Bangkok periods, the Bangkok king doesn't control the Trans-Peninsula anymore. Siam around this time, 19th centuries, doesn't control Tawai Marittanao Sea and other port on the Indian Ocean side anymore. So the focus has been even more shifted to trade with kingdoms in South China Sea and East Asia. So trade with China expand the most, and it wasn't only the expansion in terms of scale of trade, but the nature of trade also changed, because Ayutthaya, when you talk about Ayutthaya trade, you're talking about forest product, you're talking about spices, expensive item that you do not ship a lot to make a lot of money. Basically, each pieces cost more. But in early Bangkok period, most important export items happens to be rice and later on sugar and pepper. Pepper was, kind of expensive, but then rice and sugar doesn't really cost a lot. So if you want to make enough money by selling rice and sugar, you need to load a lot of rice and sugar into huge boats so that it's worth the journeys. So when Bangkok became the rice port, the port that export rice, is required more manpower, because if you want to make money from selling rice, you need a lot of people to come and grow rice. That's the first level. And then you need a lot of people to harvest or collect the rice grains. And after that, you still need a lot of people to move a heavy sack of rice, from the field to the port and from the port to the boat. So all the three processes require lot of manpowers. Manpowers was something we do not have a lot in Southeast Asia at all. That's why around this time, you see a huge wave of Chinese migrants from southern Chinese province of Guangdong and Fujian to many parts of Southeast Asia, like Bangkok, Saigon, Singapore, for example. The Chinese came and settled in the area of Sampeng, the current area of Chinatown today. And they came with them, they brought with them skill in early form of industries like sugar plantations, sugar cane plantations, distilleries, timber industry, boat buildings, and tobacco factories. Many Chinese became rich, and people call them เจ้าสัว, or you can call it billionaires nowadays. And this group of Chinese became a dominant force in the developments of Thai economies in the 19th centuries. A few of them, go on to develop rubber industries and tin mining as well. In terms of art, a larger influence, more impact, and larger population of Chinese migrants reflected in mural paintings and temple designs in the reign of King Rama III. As you can see, there's on these mural paintings, it's clearly a Chinese themes that became so prominent. And on this image, you will see that the pediments of this hall, although it's ordinary Buddhist hall, but the decorations look totally different without the golden gables, and they use small pieces of the Chinese ceramic to decorate the facade or the pediments of this temple instead. By the end of the reign of King Rama the Third, or around early 19th centuries, more Europeans show up in the area of Siam. The European has been kind of like pushed out in the event of 1688 during the King Narai, which I already explained to you. But now the Europeans started to make their way back. And the European we're talking about now in 19th centuries was quite different from the Europeans that come and trade with Ayutthaya in 17th centuries. Because European in 19th centuries already experienced industrial revolutions. So they came with steam boat, the boat that run on the steam engines, which could load much largest amount of cannons. And the ideas that the Europeans brought with them was not really just to engage in ordinary trades, but they came with the ideas of taking control of land on what we known as the colonizations. So this kind of tensions has been perceived and has been noticed among the Thai elites of the early 19th centuries. King Rama III himself even mentions to his prince when he fell ill and just about to pass away, he told his prince that from now on, there will be no more war with the Vietnamese and the Burmese, the conventional enemies or conventional competitors. And he said that from now on, we will have them, the war, only with the West. So it signaled a kind of like the turns of the worldview. The impact of the arrival of the Farang or the West or the Caucasian, as the Thai call them, was not only confined to kind of like military tensions or the push towards or the risk of being colonized, but it's also show up on how the Thai or the Siamese see things. I would call this the idea of progress and civilizations. To explain this, I want you to look at these three pictures. The first two photographs and one drawings. These three images actually represents the same persons, King Rama IV or King Mongkut, who reigns during the mid-19th centuries. The first image to your left, you will see King Mongkut kind of like seated on the thrones, and he put on uniforms that reflected, the status of the Thai king according to the Hindu Buddhistic belief. Basically, like the king as the embodiment of the god. The second image looked totally different. You have the same king seated on the chairs and dressed in European style robes. And the culture of seated on the chair was really not the Thai culture at all. The local people in Thailand and in Southeast Asia traditionally seated on the floor, wooden floor. To sit it on the chairs, usually you are people who live in the countries that you have cold winter and doesn't really want to feel the cold of the stone floor, so you sit it on the chairs. And the way he dressed, the way he sit represents, it's kind of reflect that the king himself doesn't mind to be seen living his life according to the European worldview, because only the European would come with this kind of posture. On the right hand side, you have the paintings of the same King Mongkut in the Mandarin, the Chinese Mandarin uniforms. And I think, and I guess that the last painting would look most kind of like funny or inappropriate to you, because it's like, why the king have to dress the Chinese way. This is simply because we are living in the world that totally different from the 19th centuries. The 19th century times, or even the time before 19th centuries, for the king to appear in Hindu Buddhistic Thai uniform is definitely considered okay, and it's considered not strange for the kings to appear to appreciate Chinese way of doing things, because China, as we have seen throughout the lecture today, China has been perceived as a center of civilized way of doing things by people of Asia. China exists as a center of civilization. So the way of doing things in Chinese way should be considered, kind of like trendy even. On the other hand, the European has been perceived as, foreigners whom doesn't really understand Asian cultures, believe in totally different religions, consume different kind of food. So European way of thinking often been seen as inferior. But only in this reign of King Mongkut that the king himself and some of the Thai elites know that the European has become kind of like much stronger because of the industrial revolutions, and now the idea of doing things in European way has been accepted as the new, I do not want to use the word new normal, but it's kind of new normal for the 19th century as well. The old normal was the appreciation of Chinese way of doing things, but the new normal was the switch from appreciating Chinese way of doing things to appreciate and follow European or Western way of doing things. Around this time, we have the new terms in Thai language, and that term was civilized. Civilized actually a corrupted terms that developed or derived from the English term civilized. And by saying civilized, it doesn't mean, being cultured according to the way of any civilization, but it's actually has been used to specify, a lifestyle that inspired by the Western way of doing things. The idea of progress and civilizations has kind of like pushed the Thai societies to begin questioning some topics that used to be seen as, like forbidden and not appropriate to be discussed in public openly. For example, religions and reasons. In the old day, religion is something indisputable. You should not expect to ask why you need to do this and why you need to do that. It's just kind of something for you to believe. But the new idea of progress, the new concept of reasons mean that people began to ask the question why. One strange issues that had been discussed, in great details during the reign of King Mongkut was the idea of polygamy and monogamy. Polygamy is basically one guy can have many wives. This system existed and proved to be very suitable in agricultural societies. Because agricultural society, you need manpower to work in the field. So you want to have a lot of kids. The way to have more kids, you have more wives. But European society around this time already experienced, as I say, industrial revolution. So they use machines for the productions. And once you could use machines to produce many things, then the pressure for you to have more populations to work as a manpowers would no longer be the case. And people switch from polygamies, one guy with many wives, into a system we call monogamy, one man and one wife. And this concept has been kind of like promoted by the West into Thai society around this time as well. Another most important change, I would call the most important change in Thai economic histories, was the signings of the Bowring Treaties in 1855. The Bowring Treaties basically was a treaties that the Siamese governments agree to stop the monopoly systems and allow foreigners to trade freely. By the word free, it means that foreigners who come to Bangkok or to Siam and would like to buy something, they could buy, without any restrictions, and they could buy it at the same price as foreigners. And also, if the European ship, load the goods, want to export those goods out of Siam, they would have to pay the same amount of tax as, the Chinese, the Japanese, or the Indians. There would no longer be any discriminations. Actually, Bowring Treaty was something that the Siamese government do not want to accept because it's actually losing lots of benefits. But when the British sent Sir John Bowring, the guy in in the image on the left hand side, to negotiate for these treaties, the Siamese king, King Rama IV, understand very well that although he disagrees with many terms, he's not in the positions to reject the proposal because not many years before that date, I mean the 1855, the British already proved their power by gaining victories over the Chinese navies. So the Thai governments or the Thai monarchies understand very well that if the British could defeat the Chinese that easily, then the British must be able to defeat Siam quickly as well. So what I'm trying to say is that King Mongkut and his governments got no choice but to comply and accept the Bowring treaties. The Bowring treaties kind of like, open up a new episodes of economic relations with the West. Prior to the agreements of Bowring treaties in 1855, most of the trading activities during the early Bangkok periods have been an engagement between Siam and China and other Asian partners. But now, after the Bowring treaties, then the trade and engagement shift to focus much more towards the West. And now we reach the reign of King Chulalongkorn or King Rama V, whom came into powers in 1868. The long reign of King Chulalongkorn will be a very important topic that we will discuss in our class next week because it's involved so many important transformations to the point that many historians decided to use the reign of King Chulalongkorn as a watershed that separated the classical history of Thailand from the modern history of Thailand. Classical history of Thailand is the topic that we cover today, while the modern history of Thailand, including the stories of this long and very interesting reign of King Chulalongkorn, will be a topic of our discussions next week. Okay, I believe I had tried to give you a more general view of Thai histories, and I hope that this would give you some new perspective of how we should look and understand Thai histories, rather than explain anything, all the things because this and that person is good or bad. History is not a kind of like cinemas or TV series. It's not so important that the person is good and bad. For me personally, I'm not a type of historian who really care so much, who is good and bad. But it's more about why, the reasons, the context of each developments, historical developments that kind of frame that particular people to make certain decisions. So it's not really so much about human choice. It's more about geographical, cultural, economical context that frame the developments of histories of each societies, including the Thai societies. Okay, so I would like to end the lecture today right here. You will also need to complete the quiz, and then you have to submit it to the channel, to the system, which I believe the TA would explain to you. Next week, I will see you in the class in person. I'm sorry that this week I could not be in your class because of the clash on my schedules. But I will see you in the class next week. Okay. If you have any questions, you could ask me when we met in person next week. Okay. Thank you for listening and see you next time, next week.